let's move on from me doing my best to get Darwin out of the syllabuses, and let's go on to talking a little bit about what is the answer to, or if there is an answer, what is the solution to a lot of the troubles that we see today? And obviously in the context of police brutality in the US, in the context of what many people say is systematic discrimination against black people in America, and quite possibly in other parts of the world as well, in other parts of the Western world. Can I ask you what's your reading on the movement and how to fulfill the spirit of their aims?
Well, my answer is only what you told me, frankly. I got this answer from you. I think it was very valid. I think you put it better than I would regarding the fact that these are all superficial changes. A lot of the things that the Black Lives Matter movement is moving towards is positive in some respects, in many respects, one could say. But these really are superficial changes, and you give it a few years and a lot of these issues will, they may have won some battles, they may have lost others, but the fundamental point is that tearing down statues and changing the skin color on certain paintings is not going to change anything.
Yeah.
Long term. What actually, I'm a big fan of a guy called Jimmy Dore, political commentator in the United States. And he always says, and he says it very, very, very truthfully, he said, America just got out of a presidency, an 8-year presidency of a black man with a middle Muslim name that was a middle Muslim name, Barack Hussein Obama, right? And Black Lives Matter didn't start in Trump's time. It started in his time. That's when Black Lives Matter started. So, the fact of the matter is that superficial changes like what's the skin color of my president, that's not going to change the underlying reality for millions of black Americans. It's not going to change the underlying reality of the way our economic structures run on an international scale to disadvantage poorer nations, especially those in Africa, with respect to the plundering of their resources. Okay, that is going to need a systematic and systemic change relating to the way fundamentally power and money is distributed in the world. And that ultimately comes down to an economic question. It doesn't come down to pulling down statues, doesn't come down to changing the color on people's skin, on paintings. It doesn't even come down to representation. You had a black Muslim, nearly did that. You had a black president.
You're Bertha.
No, I'm not Bertha. You had a black president of America who had a middle Muslim name.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think representation.
They got the biggest representation and the biggest superficial change they could possibly ask for, and it didn't fundamentally change anything.
Well, I think that's because who represents who is important. I think representation is important. It's part of the solution because inevitably such representatives will be better motivated to do things for the communities from which they hail than others will be, just naturally because it's more of your living and breathing life. But representation without people actually really wanting to change things and being in politics for the right reasons isn't really going to do much. And yeah, you need to have your eye on those systemic changes. But I guess part of my issue with the way the current discourse is that it's very much about cultural change and cultural revolution and let's be less racist, which is very positive, and I think especially in America that's still more of an issue than it perhaps is in other parts of the Western world. Not to say that cultural racism doesn't exist in other parts of the Western world, but I think in America it's potentially more pronounced because they have a much more recent history of slavery on their soil than Jim Crow laws, literally 2 generations ago. The civil rights movement was actually quite recent, 50 years ago, 1 or 2 generations ago. So they've had a very recent history of a lot of real outright racism. And then legislation changed and they got rid of that discrimination within legislation. And also it has to be said, cultural attitudes have also massively changed. It's not like there's been no progress in racism for the everyday person in America. Now, it may change regionally, it may change according to other things, but obviously there are improvements. But I think the trick which many are missing is the way that racism becomes integrated into the class system. Because if you have generations where black people are deprived of economic liberty, and then they have generational poverty, they essentially become massively overrepresented in the lower socioeconomic classes. And you can say this for other minorities as well, but I think in the American experience, especially Black people. And that is what's happened. The wealth which was created amongst Black communities came at a much later period than the wealth that was created in the post-World War II boom. At a time where 30 years later, let's say, home ownership was less, your money went much less further, and compounded with that, you also had legislation like the drug laws that the documentary 13th goes into in some really interesting detail. So you do have legislation feeding into it. But basically, racism becomes ingrained in classism. And at that point, you can have all the cultural change that you want, and you're not really going to be addressing the issue. Because let's say you actually have zero racism. Let's say you can wave a magic wand and there's no racism that comes from anyone in America. Okay, racism goes. Now, that would be a significant improvement. You'd have a lot less police brutality, and other issues would improve. I'm not saying that wouldn't have an effect. But is that really going to make Black communities or Black people in whatever communities they're in better off necessarily on a wider scale, in terms of, are they going to be economically uplifted? Are they going to be able to provide for their families? Are they going to have more healthcare? Are they going to be able to provide more education? And all the different health and lifestyle indicators that go along with improved wealth? No. It's not going to change that. What you need to do is actually improve things on a socioeconomic levels as wider policies to lift up all the people who are in the lower socioeconomic classes and give them their economic liberty. But that's a lot harder. It requires a deeper analysis, and it requires a lot more political change and political willpower. So from my mind, at least, what we're seeing a lot of politicians jumping onto the bandwagon of Black Lives Matters, probably largely in good faith. And they're to be commended for that. And we have a lot of corporations jumping onto that. But I found a really funny example, which is in Netflix. I was on Netflix the other day, and now they have a Black Lives Matters compilation, and they've got all this stuff front and center. Well, it's very easy for them to do that, and I'm sure at least the staff who are doing that, they're doing it out of probably a place of goodwill. But they don't pay any tax, basically. In the UK especially, it came out in recent reports, they, like every corporation of their size, siphons off all their tax and says, we're actually in Amsterdam. Right? And it's like, well, do you not think that paying, the many millions which you make, or billions that you potentially make worldwide, to the taxman would do something to help more deprived communities? Well, yeah, but, the law's like that. And fair enough. The law is like that. You can actually do that perfectly legally. So I think it's very easy for corporations to have jumped onto this, because it's easy, doesn't require them really to change anything financially, doesn't really affect their shareholders. And actually not actually advocating for any systemic change. They haven't, Nike, Netflix, Google, Apple, they haven't got together and said, what we need? We need better tax laws to stop us offshoring all of our revenues, all of our profits, and so that we can really, give money to the taxman, and we need the taxman to be really accountable and to spend this on more deprived communities. That's not happening. And I think there's a reason for that, because it affects people's bottom lines. So I guess my overall point is that cultural change is good and positive, but it's going to be insufficient for the change that you actually want to see. The change that you really need is socioeconomic.
Yeah, well, actually, you do need socioeconomic change, but what's really underpinning the desire to keep your profits afloat at the expense of other people? That's greed and selfishness and, ultimately moral qualities. Moral qualities which are underpinned by your spiritual beliefs. Yeah. Okay. So if you have a belief that you will be held accountable for every penny that you spend in your life, and you genuinely believe that, and how you've spent that money, and you'll be questioned as to how you've spent that money, then you're going to be thinking twice before you offshore your money and pay absolutely zero income tax. There's a whole chapter of the Quran, actually, one towards the end, which talks about avoiding tax and the consequences of that for individuals. So, avoiding the payment of legal arms. So that's what actually underpins a socioeconomic problem, is actually a spiritual and a moral crisis. I mean, we were discussing morality earlier with respect to the racism issue. Yeah. Specifically relating it to Darwinism. Yeah. And one thing that, we have to remember is that morality is actually just a system of priorities. And your system of priorities is defined by what you consider to be your purpose in life. So if you're a mother and you have a child, and you love that child more than anything else in the world, then your priority is always going to be the safety and the security of that child over and above everything else. And it necessarily has to be so if you genuinely love that child more than anything else in existence. Right? Because that's the definition. If you love something more than anything else, you're going to be able to be willing to protect it at the expense of anything else. Right? So the consequence of that is that when that mother is put in a situation whereby she, the interests of her child run contrary to the interests of what is right, of telling the truth, of not harming or letting harm come to another child, okay, then necessarily, not incidentally, necessarily, she will, in actual fact, go on to do that evil action. And that's a natural consequence of her priorities in life. That's a natural consequence of what's her purpose in life, which in itself is a natural consequence of what she loves most in life. So in actual fact, morality is, people have a veneer of morality because they live in a society whereby, for most people, especially in the UK and sometimes in the US, but less so in the US, with income inequality, people are able to actually meet ends meet. They are able to feed their families. They are able to operate within the social circle and meet their needs to a sufficient degree that they will not go out and break social norms and violate other people's rights in a brazen and blatant fashion. But when that no longer happens, and when the political and the economic state becomes so dire that people can no longer meet the needs of those things for which they had obeyed the social contract, okay, then it will necessarily lead to revolution, especially and very rapidly in a society which is a-religious, in which the individuals do not believe that they will be held accountable for their rebellious behavior towards other human beings or towards the government. So, that's just the natural consequence of it. And so, I would not be surprised if we're heading towards a revolution in America in particular, because with the coronavirus situation, with the cultural issue crisis of Black Lives Matter, and in addition with the total failure of policymakers to actually provide money to ordinary hardworking Americans in terms of making ends meet, and instead of giving $5 trillion to corporations, No,
come on. It'll trickle down. It'll trickle down. I don't know what you're talking about.
So, you're going to necessarily have a situation whereby people, many of whom do not believe in God, many of whom, even if they do believe in God, don't necessarily believe they'll be held accountable for their actions, can no longer meet ends meet. And so that is when you get the clash of, when morality as a concept breaks down. If you don't believe in God and if you don't have the belief in accountability.
Well, what about atheists and humanists who say that what you need to do is minimize suffering and maximize well-being? I mean, isn't that enough? There is something I wanted to come on to here, which is an article on our website, rationalreligion.co.uk, where we gave a few examples of why the kind of atheistic attempts at morality really fail. Because this is the common refrain, maximize well-being and reduce suffering, and that's all you really need. But it doesn't work. So I just want to read out one or two paragraphs from this. Is that all right with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we could probably summarize the points for people rather than reading it for them.
Yeah, but I'm trying to remember them, so I want to read them. So I mean, the first point is basically, the issue of utilitarianism, where if increasing well-being becomes a numbers game, then is torture, is torture allowed? Because you could potentially torture one person and get information that could save 10 people. Right. So then,
that's the classic thing Sam Harris agrees with, isn't it? Because it does make logical sense.
At least he's consistent. But then let's take another example of what about where people say you should treat people in the same way that you want them to treat you, for instance, or you should maximize well-being and minimize suffering. Let's see if that works with these other examples. So take an accountant of the Rothschilds, the richest family on earth. Imagine he is one day tempted to steal some money from his luxury-loving employers, just £1,000. He has the skills to easily get away with it. He will certainly benefit from the extra money, and he knows that his billionaire employers will never miss it. He looks at religious morality that tells him that such theft is unlawful and that he will be held responsible. But our accountant is much too enlightened for this religion nonsense. To humanism he goes, and what does he find? Maximize well-being, minimize suffering. Well, he thinks no one will suffer and his well-being will increase, and so it would seem that theft is not only immoral, but positively a good thing. Then let's turn to a rather more sordid affair, literally. A married woman and her tempting lover. She finds herself in a dissatisfied marriage, but feels that it could all pick up if she lets herself indulge just once with her newfound friend. She waits until her husband is out of the country, so he can't find out, but then her conscience prickles. This is adultery. That can't be right, can it? And she pauses for thought. Humanism. As she pauses for thought, humanism, wonderful humanism, by which I mean secular humanism, comes to her aid. She remembers that delightful Stephen Fry video which said we should do what makes us happy. Maximize well-being and reduce suffering. Needless to say, she went and maximized her well-being. So
I love that last line. I think they get the idea.
Yeah, well, I could should I do 20 more minutes of examples? No? Okay.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea.
We'll put the link for that article in the description below on YouTube. But I think it goes to show that actually without real moral guide and without real moral accountability, there is no morality. You're essentially left to do whatever you want without guidance. Which, as you said, is what underpins the lack of responsible actions on the part of many leaders through generations in their treatment of minority communities. And so for that, that is really going to be the ultimate solution. Yes, we need to work on all manner of other things, but you actually need humans to make better moral choices. And in order to do that, you really need to for them to be motivated by beliefs. So it's certainly possible to make progress just basing on the general moral conscience of humanity, but it all becomes harder. And you're really fighting a much more of an uphill battle. Is that a fair assessment, would you say?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, people never take it back. They say socioeconomic change. But what underpins socioeconomic change is human decisions which are motivated by beliefs as to what will benefit them, what will harm them.
Yeah.
And that's where religious belief is indispensable. And the idea that you can get rid of religious belief when it served humanity, even if you're an atheist, who believe you're confronted with the fact that human beings actually have developed religious belief, even if you believe they developed it themselves. And a lot of atheists then flee to the idea that it must be beneficial in some way for society to progress. Well, take that a bit further. Why is it beneficial? And so, this is one example whereby I think its benefit is very clear. It's the concept of accountability that it gives to a human being. I mean, in terms of the kind of systematic racism that's happened in the United States, one big example which has gained kind of fame in recent years, not fame, but people know about it a bit better. Infamy, in a way, is the concept of redlining. So I don't know whether you've come across the idea of redlining.
Yeah.
So it was coined by John Knight, who was a sociologist in the 1960s, I think. Basically, black people were ghettoized, especially black people in America were ghettoized, and banks and institutions, especially banks who would loan money to people for their mortgages, they would basically put red lines around certain neighborhoods and say, anybody from this postcode or zip code, as they say in the United States, he's not going to get a loan. And they'd find it much harder to get a loan. In addition, you look at the school system in the United States, it's built on the idea that the funding comes from the local, what we would call in the UK, council tax. So your local neighborhood tax, which in itself would be based on the value of the houses in that area. So if you have a poor neighborhood with a poor school, then that poor school gets hardly any funding because it's in a poor neighborhood. I mean, it's actually backwards.
Yeah.
It's actually backwards. It should actually, if there was any kind of equity behind it, it would actually be that the funding goes most to the poor areas and least to the wealthy areas.
Yeah.
But it was literally consciously constructed so that funding would go to the richer areas rather than poorer areas. So that's an example of a kind of systematic change which has generational consequences. Anytime you mess with the education of the next generation, you're not looking at a change that's fixed by, electing a black president with a Muslim middle name. Yeah. You're looking at a change that needs a generational, systemic solution to it.
And usually, especially in this current context, very much economic policies. And that's a really good example of actually how race turns into class and how, and in a sense, actually, one can say that actually it was always classism to begin with. because actually the racism was used to justify the classism. Because why were black people? Why was the whole transatlantic slave trade even created in the first place? Oh, so they can create an empire of cotton, make huge profits, and they rapidly grew as a country, America, and really all the empires who use this kind of slave labor. I mean, there's literally nothing cheaper. It's basically, I think, at its root, in a sense, basically socioeconomic, because it's the easiest thing in the world economically to just have slave labor and take off all the profits, and then there comes all the racism to justify that. And actually, that's borne out historically, because very early in the slave trade, many white poor people were enslaved as well, and you had actually, in some respects, multiracial slaves. But then racism came through more because it was used to justify the slavery of the blacks, and then that started to be changed. So I mean, there are plenty of poor white people who are still, certainly economically left out. But I think people don't quite appreciate that. Originally, it's basically classism from the very root. Racism comes into it and then changes the nature of those classes to racialize the classes. And now we've got the opposite thing happening, where then you have the racism in a cultural sense starting to fade, but the class inequalities persisting through the generations.
And in fact, because you have the extreme income, not just income, but also extreme income, economic inequality within societies that previously would parasitize on people of darker skinned by going and exploiting them and enacting slave labor. Yeah. You now have, in a way, a supranational class of individuals who have no kind of allegiance to a particular country. They have allegiance to where their money is going to make the greatest profit. And whether they enslave the poor white guy in Kansas, known as Clark Kent, who then grows up and he becomes strong and realizes he's an alien from anyway, that's a different story. But so I got
or the poor New York photographer, Peter Parker.
No, my point is that whether that supranational class of Jeff Bezos of the world, use the pseudo slave labor and pittance that they give to the white guy in America, or they employ the Indian in London or whatever, it doesn't make a difference. They don't care about race anymore.
Yeah.
And they don't have an allegiance to any particular race either. They have an allegiance to a particular power structure.
So what we then have is that the idea of subjugating peoples basically comes out from a materialist worldview. It can't come out really from an authentically religious worldview, because you're responsible for your actions and you recognize that you'll be responsible for how you treat other people, and that wealth isn't the end point of your life. So I hate it. I hate it when people start blaming religion for these things, when religion has explicitly, an explicit teachings against these positions. And if people disregard those teachings and then go ahead and do it, claiming it's in the name of religion, well, are you so thick so as not be able to see that? Yeah. Yeah, because people can do what they want fundamentally, but it's a question of whether that's justified within the religion or actively taught against. But I was just trying to sum this up with saying that a materialist worldview, very often or essentially inevitably leads to this, and it doesn't put any checks on the greed of people. They then subjugate people in various ways in order to augment their wealth, and that subjugation, creates socioeconomic classes. And then you can have philosophies, be they cultural or in some respects religious, coming to justify that subjugation. And then it can take particular forms, such as with racism in the transatlantic slave trade and racism which persisted throughout that. Is that basically what we're saying here?
We are, but I mean, I'm conscious of the fact that people are going to point out that most of the people who committed the atrocities against West Africans were Christians. And ostensibly very religious people. Yeah. But we kind of addressed that in our previous video, and I don't think it's pertinent necessarily to raise it in every video. But basically, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think, this is something we spoke about in the previous episode as well. But I think Christianity amongst religions, or modern Christianity, is a bit of a special case, because Paul, who we take as really the founder of Christian doctrines, said that the law is a curse. They literally said that the law is a curse. So the moral law of Moses, which tells you what to do and what not to do, is a curse, and that Jesus took this curse unto himself through his atoning death. He basically did away with the whole idea of following the law. And modern Christianity says that you should just believe in, or Christianity from Paul says that you should believe in Jesus. And if you believe in Jesus' atoning death, then essentially all your sins are forgiven. And it takes away the whole incentive of being, accountable for your actions, and also takes away, the whole law which you're supposed to be following. Now, it's also true that, many Muslims and Jews and other people from other religions which have a moral law also commit crimes. Great crimes, including slavery. And what can you say apart from, especially in the Islamic case, but I imagine in the original teachings of other religions as well, they're not following their religion properly. So we're not saying that, religion, that religious people can't be bad and that they can't do criminal things. It's just that when they do it, they don't find, that's not supported, I think, especially in the Islamic case, by their actual religious teachings. And in most cases, their religious teachings completely go against that. And in every case, the original teachings of their prophets go against the things which they're doing. So you have to, A, have a religion which says that you're accountable and gives you a moral law, and B, you have to follow it. But if you take away, religion as a whole and you're just left with atheism, then you are left with a moral vacuum in which anything can be justified. There's a great David Belinsky quote, which is
I was just about to say that.
Why don't you say it? You remember it better than I do usually.
I mean, he always says, he said in this fantastic, it was in the debate with Hitchens, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, he says that if an old man's hobbling across the road with only a walking stick to aid him, and you come along and you kick the walking stick out of his hand, can you really expect him to walk faster?
Yeah.
So the point he's making is that if humanity is barely stumbling along in terms of its moral practice with the belief that they will be held accountable for their actions, is the removal of the belief that they will be held accountable for their actions likely to improve their moral state or make it worse?
Yeah. And the ultimate answer will be to also reform their understanding of religion and to return them to a true spiritual connection to God and a real belief in the fact that they will be accountable. Because you can ostensibly be Muslim or a Jew or a Christian while actually not having any kind of real belief in it. So that's another aspect of it.